The three women sat near the spring, their hands busy with basket weaving, their eyes sharp on the horizon. They were called the Ghost-Wind Widows, Ilona, serene as still water, Chuli, whose laughter had once been frequent, and Leah, fierce as a hawk. Their husbands, warriors all, had fallen to sickness 2 winters past, leaving them bound not by blood, but by shared grief and a hardened independence. They wanted no new shadows in their lives. Then the cowboy came, a white man named Eli Walker, lean and dust-colored, leading a bony cow and a horse with a limp. He had bought a small, scrub-filled parcel on the edge of the reservation from a crooked government agent, land the people never ceded. He built a poor shack of leaning timber, and his attempts at digging a well yielded only dust. Each day, he struggled, a solitary figure of clumsy failure against the vast Arizona sky. The widows watched his floundering from the shaded bluffs. "Look," Leah would say, a cruel smile touching her lips. "The pale weed tries to grow in stone. His horse has more sense." Chuli would mimic his awkward walk, the way he tipped his hat to his unheeding cow, sending Ilona into silent shakes of laughter. Their mockery was a bitter medicine, a way to feel strength in their own untouched solitude. They scorned his poor hunting, his patched clothes, his lonely campfire songs that carried on the night wind. He was a joke, a symbol of the invading world that had taken so much, now rendered harmless and ridiculous. When they crossed paths at the trading post, they ignored him completely, their cold shoulders a wall of disdain. Eli would merely nod, his blue eyes missing nothing, saying nothing. The trouble came from the north. A band of reckless, whiskey-drinking raiders, both white and outcast Apache, began stealing cattle and horses from both the tribe and the scattered settlers. They were violent and lawless. Eli Walker, surprisingly, proved to have a steady aim and a cool head. During one raid on the reservation's horse herd, he fought alongside the Apache warriors, his rifle covering their retreat. He took a bullet graze across his ribs doing it. Tribe leader, Nanton, an old man with eyes like weathered flint, took notice. He saw more than the widows did. He saw that Eli's land held the only year-round spring left after the drought. He saw that the cowboy, though isolated, was a man of his word at the post. He saw a strategic alliance against a common enemy. One evening, Nanton summoned the 3 widows to his lodge. His voice was not unkind, but it was final as mountains. "The ghost wind blows between you and the world. This is not strength, it is a slow death. The white man, Eli Walker, has fought for the people. He has water. He has no woman, and you have no protectors. The raiders will target lone households. Strength must be woven together." Ilona felt the blood drain from her face. Chuli's mocking smile froze into a mask of horror. Leah's defiance sparked. "We need no protector. Especially not that stumbling calf." Nanton's gaze silenced her. "It is not a request. It is wisdom for the tribe's survival. You will marry him. All 3. As our old ways sometimes allowed for warriors lost. You will weave your lives to his, and make a new strength." The decree was a thunderclap. Their mockery had boomeranged back, not with laughter, but with a sentence that felt like a cage. The joining ceremony was a quiet, tense affair. Eli, clean and solemn in his one good shirt, stood awkwardly. The women were statues of resentment. They moved into his shack, which now felt impossibly small, thick with silence. For days, they maintained their cold distance, cooking separately, sleeping apart, speaking only in clipped Apache he couldn't understand. But Eli did not play the tyrant. He extended the shack, building a new room with a separate door for them. He worked twice as hard, leaving the best portions of meat he hunted by their cooking fire. He didn't speak much, but his actions were a quiet, constant language. One afternoon, Leah found him carefully extracting a thorn from the paw of a stray dog, his touch gentle. Another evening, Ilona discovered him trying, and failing miserably, to repair one of their finely woven baskets that had torn, his large hands frustratingly clumsy. The sight struck her not as ridiculous, but as a strangely earnest tribute. The change began with the raiders. They came at dawn, 4 men, greedy for Eli's well-stocked corral. Eli grabbed his rifle, but Leah was already there, her own dead husband's bow in hand. Chuli let out a piercing, rallying cry to the nearby Apache camps. Ilona stood in the doorway, a knife gleaming. The attack was short, fierce, and repelled. In the aftermath, as Eli bound a cut on Leah's arm, their eyes met, no longer those of a mocked stranger and a proud widow, but of allies who had stood back to back. That night, they shared a single fire. Eli spoke slowly, in his broken Spanish Apache mix, of his own loss, a wife and child taken by cholera on the trail west. His solitude was not chosen, but carried. The widows, in halting words, began to share their own stories of laughter and loss. The mockery melted, replaced by a recognition of shared scars. It was not a sudden love, but a slow dawning respect, a weaving together not by decree, but by choice. Eli Walker, the stumbling cowboy, became the quiet center of their strength, and the three widows, in turn, taught him how to truly grow roots in the stone, not as a weed, but as an oak. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge over a chasm of misunderstanding. David felt both exposed and relieved, as if a tightly wound coil inside him had finally sprung loose. Lena's acknowledgement, that his silence had been a form of truth-telling, changed everything. It wasn't about verifying a ritual in an anthropology journal, it was about the human need it represented, a need so profound it had required the cloak of myth to be expressed. In the weeks that followed, a new and tender dynamic settled between them. The unspoken event of that night was not forgotten, but it was no longer a barrier. Instead, it became a reference point, a raw, honest beginning from which they could navigate forward. They continued to spend their days together, but the conversation subtly shifted. They spoke less in the abstract about ancient spirits and more in the concrete about present wounds. During long walks through the scrubland, Lena revealed that her return to the canyon was not just a romantic reconnection with heritage, but a desperate retreat from a painfully quiet divorce and a career in hospice nursing that had hollowed her out. Her grandmother's stories were not just folklore, they were lifelines, the only things that made sense when human frailty and institutional indifference had become too much to bear. She spoke of holding the hands of the dying, of being the last witness to 1,000 solitary journeys, and how, eventually, she had nothing left to give to the living. David, in turn, found his own words flowing more easily in the face of her vulnerability. He shared the weight of his father's legacy, a celebrated structural engineer who viewed architecture as pure mathematics, emotionlessly sound. He described the exquisite loneliness of his sleek Chicago apartment, a showroom of success that echoed with every footstep. He confessed the fear that his creativity, the part of him that once dreamed of building spaces that sang, had been quietly buried under an avalanche of spreadsheets, client compromises, and the sterile language of cost-benefit analysis. Now, he sketched with a different purpose. His notebook filled not just with landscapes, but with ideas for a low-income community center that felt like a warm embrace, for a library with nooks that invited conversation, for spaces designed to foster human connection rather than merely to impress. Lena would sit beside him, her quiet, attentive presence a catalyst for this new, humane inspiration. She would point to a sketch and say, "That corridor looks like it hurries people. What if it widened here, with a bench and a window to the sun?" Her insights were never about engineering, but about heartbeat and pause. One afternoon, they hiked to a high, windswept ridge overlooking the vast, sculpted expanse of the canyon. The view was staggering, a panoramic testament to time and erosion. As they sat on a sun-warmed boulder, sharing a canteen of water, Lena spoke softly, her voice almost carried away by the updraft. "I need to apologize to you, David. Properly." He looked at her, surprised. "I thought we'd moved past that." "We have," she said, her eyes fixed on a distant hawk circling on a thermal. "But an apology isn't just for the person wronged, it's for the one who did the wronging. It clears the air so you can see the view properly." She took a deep breath. "For the other night. For invoking my grandmother's story as a definitive ritual. It was, intellectually dishonest. And it put a burden on you that you didn't consent to carry." David stayed quiet, letting her find the words. "It was always a metaphor to her," Lena continued, folding her hands in her lap. "She told me that, night of truth, story when I was 16 and so heartbroken I couldn't eat. She said, Mija, sometimes words are too heavy for a broken heart to carry. Sometimes the body has to speak first, to say, I am here, in the darkness." The sharing of warmth is the first language. It was her poetic way of describing the foundation of trust. "I used it as a literal framework because I was scared. I was lonely, and you were kind in a way that felt solid, and I saw your own loneliness echoing mine across the canyon. I didn't know how else to bridge that gap. So I used a story as a bridge. But a story shouldn't be a trapdoor. David listened, the wind pulling at his shirt and her hair. This was the full, unvarnished truth, and it resonated more deeply than any claim of ancient practice ever could. It was a story of hurt people reaching for connection with the tools they had. The ritual was personal mythology, a family parable repurposed in a moment of profound human need. The deception was in the packaging, not in the emotional truth it was trying to convey. "Why did you choose that particular story?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Because it was about the power of silence," she said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were clear and deep. "And you are a man who weighs his words. I thought if I could create a container of sanctioned silence, something more honest than our careful daytime conversations might emerge. And it did. But the cost was your trust, and I am sorry for jeopardizing that." He thought about his own silence that night. It hadn't just been shock or cultural paralysis. In retrospect, it had been a conscious, if terrified, choice. A choice to observe, to receive, to not break a moment that felt, despite its profound strangeness, intensely and vulnerably human. It was the same instinct that made him study the lines of the canyon before sketching them. "I'm glad you did," he said, the words surprising him with their conviction. "It was terrifying and confusing, yes. But it broke something open in me. I've been designing buildings to stand against the wind, to resist pressure, but I never realized I was just trying to build thicker walls around myself. You didn't just crawl into my bed that night, Lena. You cracked the foundation." A single tear traced a path through the fine dust on Lena's cheek, but she was smiling. So the ritual, even my clumsy, flawed version of it, served its purpose. It served a purpose, he conceded, a soft smile touching his own lips. A vital one. But let's call it what it is now. A human moment. A risky, messy, desperately human moment of two people trying to connect across a canyon of their own making. She laughed then, a light, free sound that was carried off by the wind. "I can live with that." As the end of his month-long retreat loomed, David felt a seismic shift within, as permanent as the geologic folds around him. The canyon had given him more than inspiration, it had given him a mirror and then a blueprint for a different kind of life. His sketches solidified into a coherent proposal for a cultural center that would honor local indigenous history not as a static museum exhibit, but as a living, breathing part of the community, with classrooms, gardens for traditional plants, a storytelling hall, and spaces for local artists. He ran every detail by Lena, who offered insights and corrections with a gentle firmness born of genuine passion. "This wall should face east, for the morning sun," she'd say, or, "the entrance shouldn't feel like a threshold to be crossed, but an embrace to be entered." On his last evening, they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread on his porch. The air was warm and carried the scent of creosote from a recent rain. The tension was gone, replaced by a deep, comfortable familiarity and a bittersweet ache of impending farewell. They had navigated the ambiguity and arrived at a genuine friendship, one tinged with an unacted-upon attraction that they had both acknowledged silently and set aside, like a beautiful artifact too fragile for daily use. "What will you do when you go back to your glass towers?" Lena asked, stirring her tea. "I'm going to present this cultural center proposal," David said, patting the thick portfolio beside his chair. "And I'm going to start saying no to projects that don't feed my soul. I might even take a sabbatical to work with communities out here on sustainable design." He paused, looking at her. "What about you?" "I'm staying," she said simply, with a finality that suited the enduring landscape. "I've been accepted to work with the local tribal council on their oral history project. My grandmother's stories, and the stories of others, deserve a proper place. Honestly told, without embellishment." David nodded. It felt right. This was where she was whole. He reached over the small table and took her hand. It was the first time they had intentionally touched since that night. Her hand was warm, strong, and calloused from work. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for the ritual. For the truth. For the crack in my foundation." She squeezed his hand, her grip firm and sure. "Thank you for your silence. And for finally breaking it." That night, as David packed his bags, he took down the dreamcatcher from above the bed. He studied its careful weave, the feathers that had trembled that strange night. It no longer seemed like a mysterious token from an opaque culture, but a beautiful symbol of a filtered experience, The bad dreams of suspicion, fear, and isolation had been caught, and only the good ones of growth, understanding, and connection had come through. He carefully wrapped it in cloth and placed it in his suitcase, a totem not of mystery, but of a lesson learned. He left at dawn. Lena was there to see him off, standing by her old pickup truck. They hugged, a long, tight embrace that communicated everything words could not: gratitude, shared solitude, mutual healing, and a farewell that was not an ending. No more words were needed. Driving away, the magnificent canyon walls receding in his rearview mirror, David didn't feel the expected ache of departure. He felt full, purpose settling in his chest like a solid, well-laid stone. The story that had begun with a shocking nocturnal claim had unfolded into a profound lesson about the spaces between truth and tradition, silence and speech, architecture and home. She had crawled into his bed wearing almost nothing, claiming an Apache ritual. He had stayed silent, and in that charged, silent space, they had both been forced to listen, to the frantic beat of their own hearts, to the unvoiced yearnings beneath their carefully constructed lives, and finally, to the simple, healing power of an honest word. The ritual had been a story, but the transformation it sparked was utterly, beautifully real.